Today, I'm going to share a little bit about editorial strategy in the time of COVID-19 and post-COVID-19. I started my career as a scientific researcher, so it's really ingrained in me that scientific inquiry is incremental. This can often also mean that it's slow moving. Our understanding of COVID-19 has also been incremental, but I think here the difference has really been in the acceleration and scrutiny with which this research was conducted and reported really from the very beginning. So as Hannah mentioned, we've been in this almost 2 years. The first reports of what would be known as COVID-19 were made on the very last day of 2019, where a cluster of pneumonia cases had been discovered and were being investigated in China. And just 11 days later, the first draft of the genome sequence of COVID-19 was shared on January 10th. And this is really incredible pace. So the first several weeks and months of the pandemic, and actually really since then, have been a rapidly shifting landscape of information. So what can we learn about how the scientific and scholarly publishing communities responded, and how can we continue to apply this when things hopefully start to settle back in? So I want to start by sharing an example of the process of scientific discovery through the lens of COVID and how publishing supports that. And this is in how our understanding of COVID developed and how it's transmitted. So early on, of course, it was critical to understand human transmission of the disease so that we could slow its spread. It was assumed and later shown that airborne transmission through aerosols was the primary risk to transmission. But an early paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, published on March 17th, 2020, also discussed the surface viability of the virus. And this paper showed that the virus could persist on stainless steel and plastic surfaces for several days. Now, it wasn't a direct study of surface transmission of the disease, but the study was hyped by the news media and others that surface transmission could in fact be important. So you might remember this is when we were all wiping down our grocery bags and wearing gloves to open doorknobs. So several follow-on papers built on this initial NEJM study that showed that while the virus could indeed persist on surfaces, it really wasn't a primary transmission mechanism between humans. So this is an example of how the intense interest from the media and the public amplified these types of studies at a moment in time. But since then, more research has continued to support airborne transmission as the primary mechanism. Now, follow-on studies are a much less headline-grabbing result, and so can take longer to get out to the public to affect changes in policies, but eventually they do. And now, of course, we've seen this in stronger mask mandates and social distancing protocols as a result. So the pace at which information has been released has really increased the ratio of noise to signal in the time of COVID. Since 2020, the Discovery Service Dimensions estimates that over 500,000 articles and 60,000 preprints have been published related to COVID-19, which is just staggering. Journals have been flooded with new submissions, which have either been directly related to COVID-19 or have been from researchers who were using their time in lockdown to catch up on publishing pre-COVID results. And our industry has changed our editorial practices to cope with that so-called COVID bump. So many journals fast-tracked articles about COVID-19 in order to get this information out more quickly. And in some cases, journals have cut their publication times in half. This fast-tracking has not been a result of sloppy reviewer reports, as one might think. And in fact, a study that was published in the journal Research Evaluation in January of this year shows that actually the length and quality of reviewer reports have been consistent between submissions both before and after COVID. Actually, the speed is because a lot of editorial offices were not asking for additional experiments or data to be run, which has cut down on the number of rounds of re-review. Publishers, I think, have recognized that these additional experiments were perhaps not practical and maybe also not needed in order to complete the report. There have also, of course, been collaborations amongst publishers. So OASPA assembled publishers and platforms to compile a rapid reviewer list that could be shared amongst publishers to provide both faster review of COVID papers and also transfer amongst journals for these important COVID papers. And of course, we've heard about preprints. So preprints also became an important way to get research results out quickly. And these preprint services have grown really exponentially as a result. So medRxiv, which only just launched in June 2019, just a few months before COVID really hit, went from posting several dozen preprints each week to over 500 each week. And preprint servers early on recognized that they were being used as an additional important source of information about the disease by the media and the public. And as a result, they took swift action to make sure that users who were coming to the preprint servers understood that the results posted there were preliminary and had not yet been peer reviewed. They also tightened their screening criteria. So for example, bioRxiv and medRxiv declined to post papers that predicted therapies for COVID-19 based only on computational studies because it was seen as just too risky to have that kind of preliminary result out there. Authors also changed their practices and became more cagey with their language. So in a study published in Learned Publishing in July of this year, authors analyzed abstracts of preprints both before and after COVID-19 and found that in COVID-19 abstracts, there were a greater use of hedge words, so words like may or might or suggest. So authors themselves were also trying to tone down some of the positivity of their conclusions because of this awareness that the media and public were scrutinizing their results. Of course, all of these preprints and published articles was bound to lead to retractions and corrections, and there were several high-profile studies in medical journals early on about treatments, which were later retracted. Now, what's stunning to me is not that these and other articles may have ultimately been corrected. In fact, based on the proportion of COVID-19 articles that have been published, the rate of retraction so far is around the same as other scientific topics. What's really stunning to me is the speed in which this has been done. So it often takes years for an incorrect conclusion to be identified and then corrected or retracted. But of course, in the accelerated time of COVID, in some cases, it's taking just merely weeks. So the pace of understanding has been different, but the general model is not. Scientific inquiry is always a balance between speed and uncertainty. How can researchers release their results as quickly as possible while being certain enough about these results being valid? In fast-moving times like COVID, the scales will sometimes tip in favor of speed. And almost 2 years in, what has all of this led to? I think researchers and published have both flexed tremendously to get us to where we are, which is with 3 vaccines developed and released and cases dropping. There are 3 lessons that I'd like to leave you with from an editorial perspective that I'm taking from COVID-19. So first, I believe that peer review is still the best system. And precisely in times like this of stress and abundance of information, peer review really helps to cut that noise. But of course, improvements can be made in how we do this and at what point in the research life cycle we do this. It's easy to see that peer review burdens are real, and we must continue to widen the tent of reviewers by educating and supporting them. Preprints also have been shown to contribute to the rigor and veracity of research and of the final published article. Second, we've heard a lot about open science today, and I believe open science does enable faster discovery. Open access to articles and open data sharing gets research into the hands of the people that can use and build on it. And in a global crisis, we've seen that it's critical and life-saving. So we must continue to work together to find sustainable ways to support open access to articles and better data sharing. And finally, getting the balance between speed and uncertainty right. So how do we go as fast as we can without breaking things? Some of the editorial measures that have been taken at publishers can continue, so limiting the tendency for just one more experiment or data set in order to enable those research results to get out more quickly. And also, importantly, I think communicating the balance between speed and uncertainty to the public and to the news media is an important collaboration between researchers and publishers that we should undertake. So how do we get information out quickly in order to affect policy or keep the public safe while not overhyping those results? So I would argue that it's precisely the networked effect of our ecosystem, which includes really all of us, researchers, publishers, the news media, funders, science communicators, and the general public itself, that's made progress in our understanding of COVID-19 possible. And to me, this is really science at its best. So we've heard over and over again that we're living in unprecedented times, and hopefully this is true. But I think the lessons we've learned from how to communicate in a time of crisis can be applied in more normal times as well. So we can continue to advance research by disseminating and building upon results as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Penelope. Penelope, how many of these, so there are some changes that happened in editorially during COVID. Do you see any of these continuing forward? I mean, for example, do you think authors might continue to be a little more careful about how they word their statements? Or do you think that now that people are used to things coming out faster, that speed is going to dominate for a while, or do you think we're just going to go back to where it was before?
I think that it will probably be somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. So I don't think that it's sustainable, the type of speed and the rapid review that a lot of editorial offices have really pushed for, and a lot of publishers and journals, and also the reviewers themselves and the authors. So that's not necessarily sustainable, but I think some of these practices in terms of the criteria that's set by publishers and making sure that it's still valid, but enough of a valid result in order to be released will continue. And I think the other thing too, I mean, I was struck by how many times I'd read an article in the New York Times about COVID, and there would be a distinction between a peer-reviewed paper and a preprint, for example. And I think that type of interest in science and how it's communicated will continue. And also the sources with which news media and the general public is really getting its information. So yeah, I think there are some things that we want to continue to retain post-COVID, and some that probably aren't possible.
Penelope, one question on the proliferation into other fields. So obviously you have been focusing very much on those disciplines that are directly impacted with the research on COVID, for example. But what happens to other publishing areas? So let's assume the humanities and the social sciences. Does it make sense to basically bring those changes or observe for those changes also the history of the British Midlands in medieval times or something like that? So what do you think? Can you see that there as well? And if not, isn't it just increasing the different speeds we see in publishing anyways, and the different levels of professionalism, let me put it that way?
Yeah, so I work for AIP Publishing, which publishes in physics and physical science, which is sort of adjacent to some of the areas that are more directly impacted by COVID-19. And we also saw a COVID bump in submissions. And I've also read that Archive, for example, which traditionally publishes in more traditional fields of physics in terms of preprints, also saw an increase in the number of preprints. So I think that across the board, there's been more submissions that have been generated. Some of this is from COVID and from that lockdown period where researchers were submitting more articles. But I think generally, we're going to continue to see that increase in published articles. And this is where I think having more of an ability to cut through that noise and really identify those areas or those papers where there's really important research, and how to connect those across fields as well is going to continue to be important. So to me, it's clear that with COVID, it wasn't just, medical or health professionals or people directly studying coronaviruses before COVID came along, really making improvements in this area, but more of the collective fields of science coming together and working really interdisciplinary to solve this problem.